So welcome today, November 28th, for our 2023, one of our 2023 Native American Alaska Native Service Area Community of Practice sessions. We are very excited to have our guest speaker and one of our very own joining us. As you probably know from signing up, we are having some discussions about Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, different applications, protocol considerations, and thinking through how to incorporate Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, or ITEK, in environmental collaboration and conflict resolution spaces. My name's Stephanie Lucero. For those of you that don't know me, I am the manager for the Native American Alaska Native Service Area. Joining us today are some of our team from the Morris K. and Stewart L. Udall Foundation's National Center for Environmental Conflict Resolution, which we just refer to as the National Center. Sandra Talley is joining us, also Ben Zukowski. They're going to be helping monitor the chat and helping with any technical issues you might have. Our speakers today is one of our very own from the National Center, Lauren Cordova. And also joining us today is Udall Scholar alumna, Ashley Nichole Lewis, and also a UC Davis grad student. They'll give you a little bit more introductions as we get underway. Before we get too officially started, I was hoping folks joining us via the webinar, if you could maybe introduce yourself. Who's joining us today? What encouraged you about joining in on our webinar today? Anything you want to share in the chat box. And then for those of you that are wondering, because we are on a webinar, we will have to give you permission to talk. So when we open up for discussions and questions, if you raise your hand, we'll open up the mic so folks can ask questions, and then you'll see an unmute button at that point. Otherwise, feel free to send any questions or comments in the chat box, and we'll deal with those as we go through. And yep, now we've got some folks introducing. So in addition to the chat box, we also have the Q&A box. We'll be monitoring both, but feel free to send any questions or comments in the chat box. We're going to let Lauren and Ashley do their presentations, and then we have a pretty good chunk of today set aside for discussion. So we'll open up the room a little bit more. You can either send your questions via the chat or, like I said, raise your hand, and we'll open up for questions. So as we mentioned, there's a lot going on in terms of ITEK. There's the White House guidance that Lauren's going to share a little bit about. We wanted to give some real life examples of some of the foundational pieces that go into co-producing or applying ITEK in environmental collaboration, conflict resolution, and federal decision making. So a lot of this is about giving an introductory on ITEK, talking about examples of protocol and procedure, and thinking through possible examples, and really starting the application part of Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge. What does it mean in real life? What does it look like? But I'm going to leave a lot of that to our speakers. But if you have any specific questions, again, put them in the chat box. We'll deal with those. If you have any tech issues, Ben Zukowski, who you can probably see in the chat, you can text to hosts and participants, and Ben will probably respond with any of those technical difficulties. So without further ado, I'm actually going to turn this over to our moderator for today, Lauren Cordova, and do any screen sharing required. So Lauren, take it away.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. As Stephanie said, my name is Lauren Cordova. I'm Taos Pueblo and Shoshone-Bannock. I'm also Tusuki Pueblo from New Mexico. I'm currently located in Washington, D.C. in our Udall office. And it's great to be here with y'all today. So thanks for joining us. I just want to sort of, I guess, set the space. So a lot of times when we go into Indian country as federal employees, you'll see that there are sort of formal introductions by like tribal leaders or community members. A lot of times folks will speak their language. So I'll go ahead and introduce myself to y'all in Tiwa. Northern Tiwa is the language that we speak at Taos Pueblo. So Hioho, Dotaina, Populo Mayahum, Pahusa Panpapu, Mayahum, Panpahusa, Oyan, Donwama, Lurinedbo, Oyan Kawam. So the way I just introduced myself to y'all is the way that we introduce ourselves at House. So when you are coming into a space, you'll tell people what your name is. So I actually have several names, but right now I go by my name that was given to me when I was initiated into our tribe. So when I was 16 years old, I went through our traditional initiation ceremonies, and I was named Star Snowflower, which is actually named after my dad, whose name is Snowstar, falling. So when you go into a space, you give your name, your parents' names. If you want to get even more formal or traditional with it, you can introduce your grandparents or great-grandparents. And the reason that we do this is because we want, as Native people, we want people to know who we come from, where we come from. And that's something that's important to me. And I've always been taught that that's, you know, the way it's done. So that's just an example of protocol to kick us off. We're going to get into more of that later on, but just to get us started, I do want to talk about ITEK or ITEK, however you know it, as it relates to the White House guidance. And I think, Steph, are you going to share that on your screen? Okay, cool. So we'll just do like a brief sort of overview of the definition that exists in this document. So if you want to scroll down. Yeah, okay. So the definition in this document of ITEK is ITEK is a body of observations, oral and written knowledge, practices, and beliefs that promote environmental sustainability and the responsible stewardship of natural resources through relationships between humans and environmental systems. It is applied to phenomena across biological, physical, cultural, and spiritual systems. ITEK has evolved over millennia, continues to evolve, and includes insights based on evidence acquired through direct contact with the environment and long-term experiences, as well as extensive observations, lessons, and skills passed from generation to generation. ITK is owned by Indigenous people, including but not limited to tribal nations, Native Americans, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians. So basically, that's a seeking to define a concept that is very, very ambiguous. Like when we as Native people look at this document and read that definition, in the back of our minds, we all, I mean, for the most part, we all recognize that like it's to us a part of who we are as a people and as individuals. So we as Native people, from the time we're born until the time we die, like there are things that we experience within our tribal communities that connect us to the earth, connect us to the land, connect us to our other community members, to our families, to our creator, spiritually, ceremonially. There are so many different things that are interconnected within our world that we bring to the table in any process that we are involved in. So when you read this definition, just know that there's a lot more to it than just these words. So part of what we're seeking to do today is give you a little bit of a primer or like some tools to help you navigate and better understand how to interact with folks who carry that knowledge with them every day. So I think, Steph, if you want to continue to scroll through so that folks can kind of see, get a feel for the document, that works. We're also gonna send out like a little bit of a table of contents, I think, for references, because this document doesn't actually have a table of contents. So we put that together for you. But I'm also going to read from our protocol cheat sheet that we put together, that hopefully will give you some sort of like a starting point to create pathways to collaboration when you're entering Indian country spaces. So I'll just go ahead and read. So first, we've got a quote here from Gwen Bridge, who is Saddle Lake Cree. We were fortunate enough to collaborate with Gwen for an Indigenous knowledge COP earlier this year. So the quote that we have from her is, from Indigenous oral culture, we can incorporate ITEK, traditional stories, protocols, Indigenous governance and values, spirituality, community, as well as being mindful of Indigenous processes of coming to agreement. From Western culture, we can add science, religion, laws, and technology, and democratic systems of governance. Combining both perspectives creates ethical space for all. There is balance and stability in binocular vision. Ultimately, reconciliation of both sides can only happen when we start with healing the relationship of Indigenous people to their land. So that quote was talking directly about two-eyed seeing, which is a concept that Gwen teaches on, and that concept incorporates ITEK into oh cool. So Steph put the link to the webinar, the recorded webinar, in the chat, so everybody can take a look at those materials. But basically, the concept of two-eyed seeing is that in order to do any sort of reconciliation, you have to start with bringing in both sides. So what both eyes are seeing. So one side is going to be seeing, you know, the Western values or the European constructs, and then the other side can bring in native concepts of, like she said, spirituality, community, Indigenous oral culture. And that to me is something that really stands out, because a lot of times when we come into, as federal employees, when we come into Indian country spaces, there's this need to control things. There's a need to sort of bring order to spaces that maybe normally don't operate in the same sort of way that we're used to. And a lot of times oral culture or oral tradition plays into what is being shared by tribal leaders. So for example, I know in Pueblo country, where I'm from, Taos Pueblo and Tusuki Pueblo, there are storytellers. That's our way. Like, that's how we relate to the world. And there's like a poetry to the way that we speak, but that also elongates how long it takes for people to get their point across. So sometimes when you come into these spaces with tribal leaders or spiritual leaders, ceremonial leaders, and you're coming to a meeting and you're just trying to show up and stick to a schedule, that's not going to work. That's literally not how we do things. There's an order to how we interact with the world. And for us in, you know, northern New Mexico, coming into a space always comes back to, you know, the way that it's done. So for instance, and you all will get this protocol example cheat sheet. We'll send it out after this webinar, but I have in here that, you know, some spaces might have ceremony or prayer to open meetings. And I know that's kind of a tough concept for, you know, federal employees, because they're supposed to be like separation of church and state. They're supposed to be, you know, like impartial sort of representation. But in native spaces, like, there's always an intention. So there's always like we're going to call upon our ancestors for strength. We're going to call upon our creator for, you know, guidance. And that's something that we do in our everyday lives. Like, we're always going to do that. So why wouldn't we do it in our governing systems as well? So a lot of times you'll see that people introduce themselves traditionally, like I did at the top of this session. And then, you'll go around, you may be asked to introduce yourself, where you're from, why you're there. And then there will be a prayer that opens up sort of, or sets the intention for the space. And Ashley and I talk about this a little bit, like a lot of times it's hard to know like what to do, right? Like if you're unfamiliar with protocol for a space, look around, first of all, like look around and see what other people are doing, because you don't want to embarrass yourself. And you also want to be respectful. So observe others and make sure that you know what you're meant to be doing. Are you supposed to be sitting? Are you supposed to be standing? Are your eyes supposed to be closed? You don't want to be like looking around at everybody, right? And then also ask someone beforehand, like before you even go into the meeting. It's a good idea to just, if you know anyone in that who's from that tribe or from that area, or even if they're not specifically from that area, if they're familiar with protocol in that area, just sort of ask like, hey, so I'm going to this meeting, what do I do? Like, is there anything I need to not do? Is there anything I need to be aware of? But overall, just being open to learning and open to the idea that you may not know everything, or things may not go the way that you are used to them proceeding. That's the best advice that I could give anyone who is nervous about how to approach these intertribal or even exclusively tribal spaces. And then also there's a lot to be said for time, I guess. Like the concept of time is just different in Indian country. You're not going to be in control of time always. There are going to be elders who stand up and speak, maybe in their language, maybe in English, and a lot of times it will seem like they are rambling, but there's always an intention there's always a purpose to the words that are being said. It may take a while for that point to become clear, but as a representative of the federal government, or any sort of agency or organization that is working with tribes, it is important for you to understand that storytelling as a practice is how we communicate. So going into a space and hearing about someone talking about, an elder talking about their grandchild, right, and AI or technology, like that might seem like something out of left field, like what is this guy talking about? But at the end of the story that this elder is telling, you'll find that the whole point was to demonstrate that the youth are losing touch with our culture, or the importance of language revitalization, things like that. So that's another sort of like quick tip that I would impart on anybody looking to come into tribal spaces. Also, there may be a purpose to telling a story so that it sets the timeline, or provides clarity for any meeting or gathering on a certain topic. So like if there is let me give an example. If there is like an elder who's talking about, if the purpose of the meeting is forestry, right? And there's an elder who is talking about the legacy of like land that was lost and then restored through like land into trust, or any sort of operations like that, the elder might start talking about like an old story about like coyote or something like that. Or they might start talking about an origin story for why folks use a certain type of root or plant medicinally. So yeah, it's just important to write it out, Like it feels counterintuitive when you're in a certain space for a meeting to sort of like waste time, but it's not time that's being wasted. You're actually gonna absorb more information from hearing these stories than you will from the actual functional dialogue that's happening within the meeting. And then finally, to wrap up, there, yeah, and I'll just share, Stephanie just pinged me like, time check. Yeah. Time doesn't exist, sorry. So finally, there may be some instances that arise during ECCR or other government to government proceedings or processes where it's necessary to ensure the confidentiality of spaces with ceremonial or spiritual significance to the tribe or tribes present. And I'll just read what I wrote here because it's the best way that I could sort of sum it up. The importance of these spaces to Indigenous peoples goes beyond the physical presence in the space and extends to photo, video, drawings, any kind of representation. So what I'm trying to say here is like, if you are invited on a site visit and you are taken to a place that has spiritual or cultural significance to a tribe, don't take pictures unless you are told to do so. Don't take pictures, don't sketch it out, try to forget even where it is, what it looks like, because a lot of times the locations of these spaces are kept very confidential so that folks aren't just kind of like traipsing off into, to have a picnic on, these sacred sites. Yeah, so the most sacred spaces and ceremonies to Indigenous communities in some cases used to be shared with outsiders, but have since been limited due to lack of respect for these spaces. For many Indigenous communities, we are taught that our ceremonies are done for the entire world, for all humankind. Thus, it is important to consider yourself, even if you are not Indigenous, a part of the community and respect the significance and rules of any tribal community you enter. So, for example, like I was talking about, I don't know how many folks heard me in the beginning, but I was talking about Blue Lake, which is our sacred lake that's up in these mountains at Taos. So that area, Blue Lake, was taken and put into the Kit Carson National Forest for a period of time. And, it was really unfortunate because that's one of our most sacred sites for Taos Pueblo people. And during that time, there were folks, non-native folks, using our most sacred site as a place to go, boating and fishing and picnicking and, basically desecrating the place that we believe that our souls go when we pass away. And that was devastating to elders in our tribe. And that's something that we had to recover from as a tribe, as a people. But we still, like, even after all of that, like, we still do all of our dances and all of our ceremonies and everything that we do. We always pray for the world. Like, we're always taught that everything that we do is not just for ourselves, not just for our people, but for the good of everyone. So that's just something that that I always think about too, is like Indigenous people, regardless of who we're talking about, although we have very different ceremonial knowledge and very different customs and practices, we all are taught from a very young age that we are representing not only ourselves, but our families, our ancestors, the future generations, but also everything that we do, we're doing for the world. So when you come into spaces and collaborate with us, collaborate with tribal representatives, tribal government, tribal leaders, remember that like we do everything that we can to make the world better for non-natives, natives alike. So if you could just do your part to, read up on our ceremonial knowledge or or customs and try to be respectful of those. Thanks. And now I'll introduce Ashley again. So I know Stephanie Lucero did a bit of an introduction, but I wanted to say that Ashley is a treaty salmon fisher. She's a PhD student of Indigenous and environmental history. She's a historian and the host of a new TV series called Hook, Line, and History. And she's a dog mom, and she has a killer earring collection. So with that, take it away.
And that's all the important stuff you need to know. Thank you so much. Onogwitu. Good morning. My name is Ashley. My mother is Dawn Lewis. Her father is Thomas Lewis. My grandmother is Dolores. My great-grandmother is Hattie Lewis George, and her parents were George and Mary Skamok. They 5 generations ago came from the Columbia River area. They're members of the Wakayakum Chinook Nation, and after termination and some of our people were relocated, I am currently a member of the Quinault Indian Nation. I currently reside in Northern California, just outside of Davis, California, where I am a doctoral student. Today, I want to talk about just a few things in the time that I have with you. First off, thank you so much for giving that time. I'm really excited to have these conversations. And it was so great seeing the introductions, the people coming from all over the country. We'll give a shout out to fellow Washingtonians. Many of you are here, and that's really exciting. You'll hear about some things that you recognize, I'm sure. But I want to talk a little bit about what Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge is, what it isn't, how it's played a part in what I do for a living. As Lauren and Stephanie mentioned, I'm a treaty fisher, and I have a business running salmon and steelhead guided tours on the Olympic Peninsula. I want to do a short exercise, and then hopefully I can end with a short story, but let me go ahead and share my screen and get us going here. And then, Lauren, can you give me a thumbs up if we have things that are supposed to be seen? Yay, thank you. Fantastic. Okay. So when we're talking about Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, what we are talking about is a knowledge base that began developing at least 15,000 years ago. This is based on territory, and it works on developing a sustainable and regenerative relationship with home ecosystems. It is a wealth of knowledge, and it is coded in individual Indigenous languages, which did not go away. The knowledge system is grounded in the land, and it's passed generationally. The hallmarks of the longest and most comprehensive system of knowing in this land include environmental adaptation through interaction, observation, experimentation, and experience through ecological, social, and spiritual systems. What I really want you to take away from today is this isn't just a privilege to know about. This is a responsibility that we all share together. And that this is a traditional and contemporary knowledge. It is a way of living, but it is contemporary and growing. It's especially important as Indigenous people continue to fight narratives that we are ambered in the past. We are, and always have been, dynamic actors that modify our environment, we extract from it, and we continue to live in concert with it. Indigenous people take what's best about the past and we bring it into the present. We also see ourselves into the future in this way. So having this conversation, talking about Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge is not something that's happening by accident, but by intention from people that came long, long before we did today. So let's talk about what ITEK is not. So I want to do a short exercise here. If you you don't have to close your eyes, but I like to do this when I close my eyes and I think about a perfect environment. What do you imagine when you think about a perfect environment? Do you think of trees? Do you think of water? Think about what's there and think about what isn't there. Do you see animals? Do you not see animals? Think about what this looks like for just a moment. So in this perfect idea of the environment or perfect idea of nature, a lot of times people, or I'll talk about what I see when I do that exercise. When I think about what that looks like, I think of a distinct lack of cell phone towers. I think of a lot of trees, and I think of uninhibited running water. But the first time I thought about that, I didn't see people in that. And when we think about a perfect nature, we often see human absence as a part of a perfect nature. And this is problematic because we are a part of nature. And the idea that this, ideal or perfect nature and environment is absent of Indigenous people is in part a part of the ongoing erasure of Native people. Indigenous people have been here since time immemorial. And like I had mentioned in the last slide, have modified, extracted, and have always been a part of the natural world. So when we think of Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, it is not just a workshop that we do sometimes. This is a way of life. This is, in a way, a religious practice. And it's not only, this is a common misconception, it's not only meant for Indigenous people to engage in. We want everyone to engage in it with us. It's not a tradition pulled from the past. This is a huge red flag when we think about ITEK. To just think about Indigenous people as trying to live this idea from the past is not an accurate picture of who we are. We are, and this is a contemporary knowledge system. And like I mentioned, we're not separate from the environment. People are integral in the ecosystem, and we want to imagine the ideal environment as like that with people. And Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge is not this thing that we choose to apply or not. This is a both and situation alongside Western science. Lauren talked to you about two-eyed seeing, and it's important that we use Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge as the framework that we apply Western science to. So a little bit on how I use Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge. So fishing is the way that I became connected with my culture. Because salmon are the bedrock of our lifeway, knowing salmon is the only way to know our ways as Quinault people. We are distinct people and have different stories and ways of knowing as compared to Indigenous people who are not salmon people or outside of the Pacific Northwest. But the epicenter of Quinault life is entangled with fish, an anadromous fish, one that is born in fresh water, then is carried by the river to the ocean, then returns to its spawning grounds to reproduce and start the cycle again. When I ask myself when it's time to go fishing, and when people like myself ask, when are salmon coming home? The answer is not when a regulation tells me the season is open. And it's not through temporal markers or means like they come in March. But the salmon berries start to grow, and that's how we know that the coho are near the river mouth. With certain weather and lunar patterns, we understand that the salmon are about to begin their journey. The salmon are here when the salmon berries begin to grow. When we hunt for elk, we know this because it's the time when the leaves start to turn, the fireweeds available to us. So in my way, salmon really are the epicenter of my whole idea of the world. So when I teach people to fish, it teaches them that only by our relationship with the natural world and its processes can we catch and can we engage in our salmon. And there's probably people that are looking at this photo going, those are steelhead, which is true. Those are both steelhead, but I fish for salmon and for steelhead. And then to be clear, taking an ecological focus is not separate from an economic focus. So this is a business that I run. I take people fishing, I teach them how to fish, I've been very fortunate to make a living doing that. This is a business. But through an ecological lens, I can apply my needs through an ecological world. I can then add an economic agenda that can follow in this way. And oftentimes when we take a socioeconomic focus on the environment, we often look at decline or think about climate change or the decline of a species. And it makes us, in a lot of the capacity that we work, it makes us think of the regulatory hurdles to overcome. But a socio-ecologic focus allows the economic piece to follow if you start with the ecological focus. Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge allows you to do that. So what do we get to do together here, and how can you show up in this space? One way that you can do that is through humility. We know that you're going to go into spaces where, like Lauren said, you maybe don't understand the protocols or the ceremonies, or, what are these stories? And you're not just working with one group of Indigenous people, right? You're working with a ton of distinct peoples with distinct agendas and desires and interests and needs. So learning our stories, learning our histories, being open to not knowing a lot, that humility going into those environments is what is going to allow you to do your work the most effectively. And to help. Again, Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge is not something that we adopt when we feel like adopting or when it serves our purposes. It is a life way that I hope that you'll decide to be a part of and consider the lands that raised you. There was a space that you played as a kid. What made you who you are? And how can you continue to engage with that world? And two-eyed seeing, like Lauren had mentioned, we can take an Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge framework, and then we can pair it with Western science and do great work. And that to remember that there is a traditional and contemporary component to this life way. Knowing our history will help all of us understand that Indigenous people are dynamic historical actors, that we take what's best about the past, we use it in the present, and we move it on into the future. And then I have a quote from a book that I highly recommend anyone who's interested in this knowledge system to read, and it's Tending the Wild by Kat Anderson. Kat Anderson wrote that the cultures of the Indigenous people of California are rooted in a belief that nature has an inherent ability to renew itself, to cause the return of the geese, the regrowth of the plants with edible bulbs, the germination of next year's crops of wild flowers. This belief is reflected in the names of the lunar cycles and the annual ceremonies welcoming the return of particular animals and dances honoring the ripening of acorns and other crops. But Native people also believe that renewal cannot happen in the absence of appropriate human behavior towards nature. And our interaction with that nature is profoundly important as well. I think I have a few more minutes, is that right? Okay, fantastic. So I wanted to leave with a short story that I hope will help you see how salmon can heal the pain in our world from our perspective. Recently, it was in the Pacific Northwest at Tulalip. There was Rise Up Northwest and Unity convening. This was an effort by tribes in the Pacific Northwest to meet with lots of environmental organizations and people in the interest of saving our salmon from decline. And there was a profound moment that happened on a panel at this event. And it was that there was a women's panel, because the absence of salmon has a profound impact in all of Indigenous life in the Pacific Northwest. And that it was important for women to share how that impacted them. There was a separate men's panel that did the same, a youth panel that did the same. There were lots of panels. But in this women's panel, the absence of salmon takes away, very much the foundation and fabric of what their lives revolve around. And they talked about how that impacted them. And the way that was the most profound that came out of that was each of these women shared their experiences with violences, including sexual violence. And in that panel, after they shared their experiences, everyone listened, Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people at this. And without a prior conversation, without any sort of convening at all, the men, the male leaders of a few of the tribes included Bode from Yakima, former chair, and Shannon Wheeler, Nez Perce, and another one of their young leaders. A couple of their leaders came up behind them and felt the responsibility in their culture to share their pain. And they did that through song. And the song was meant to be a healing experience for the women and to express their pain, because the women had shared theirs and the men understood their responsibility to respond to that. And in those songs, everyone had the opportunity to stand and be an active part of that healing. There were Indigenous people that were a part of that. There were non-Indigenous people that were part of that. Everyone in that room was a part of that. And that was moment. I think the broadcasting for that was turned off, but everybody left that room understanding that, like, we understand each other better now, and we understand better how salmon aren't just a part of this economic engine in the Pacific Northwest. They're not just a part of Indigenous stories and storytelling, but they are a part of the active healing of the pain in our world, as depicted by the sharing of stories of what women lose when the salmon are gone, when the men participated in singing and expressing their pain, and allowing everybody from organizations across multiple lines of divide to participate in the active healing. We can see how salmon do good in our world, even if we're not holding, selling, or eating one. So thank you so much for your time. If anyone wants to reach me, I will throw my contact information in the chat and I will send it back to Lauren.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Ashley, for sharing that story. I think that's a very impactful moment that just demonstrates like what can happen in intertribal spaces, and the types of interactions that we as Indigenous people are fortunate to witness, and even non-native people who come into those spaces. It's a blessing. So I think right now we're going to open it up to a Q&A session. So we have 45 minutes for anybody who wants to ask any questions about our presentations, or if you have any burning questions about ITEK or protocol, you can go ahead and drop those in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we can take you off of mute so that you can speak, or you can put them into the question and answer window. And we'll just monitor those windows and wait to see something pop up.
I think everybody's trying to give a moment. That was a great story and presentation to both of you. Thank you. So I will start only because I'm not seeing any hands raised or questions answered. You're getting lots of thank yous and hearts, which I'm sure you saw. So we know a lot of folks join these community of practice discussions for because they either are participating in discussions with tribes and Indigenous people, or they're facilitators working in Indigenous spaces. We have a broad group of folks. Are there any thoughts in terms of, and maybe Lauren, this is a good question for you. We have certain processes for environmental collaboration and conflict resolution. We sometimes have regulations, even though a lot of Indigenous knowledge is not about. Sorry, I was checking chat. I lost my train of thought because everybody loves your earrings, Ashley, and apparently we're even finding out where to get them. So apologies for those watching on the video. we'll send the chat in case you're interested on the earrings. But so thinking through, you know, you both mentioned the importance of using an Indigenous framework and then applying, you know, particularly with Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, applying Western science to that framework. Do you have any thoughts in terms of what non-Indigenous facilitators or facilitators that are kind of stuck in these systems of federal regulatory guidelines, like what would be the best advice or thoughts in terms of developing a process that allows for ITEK dialogue in a respectful and inclusive way?
I think first and foremost, talking with the tribal representatives who you're going to be collaborating with and building out that framework with their input is crucial, because a lot of times in Indian country, tribal leaders, I mean, I've heard this over and over again, like tribal leaders bemoan, you know, working with agencies who think that tribes are not informed on the issues, or there's like not enough time to get things done. So really showing up as an agency and being like, yeah, here you go. Like, these are all the tools that we have. These are the resources that we can commit. This is our, you know, the capacity that we have for this particular project or process. What do you need from us, or how would you like to see this process go? And I know that sounds daunting. I know that sounds like, you know, terrifying, because then you're kind of at the whim of somebody else's schedule, but sometimes you have to be. It's uncomfortable, but sometimes you got to do that. And realistically, you as the government representative, the federal government representative or non-native representative, will actually be setting yourself up for success in the long term, because that tribe or those tribal leaders will remember that and will be more willing to work with you collaboratively from then on. And I'm seeing like all these other questions come in.
Yep.
So do you want me to go ahead and jump into this?
Yeah, let me just double check. Ashley, did you have anything to add?
Okay.
Okay. So I saw a question from Kaylin, and then I'll go through the question answer. And Lauren, I'll let you figure out whether it's you or Ashley that'll answer. So Kaylin in the chat was mentioning the importance of patience and different pacing and styles of communication across cultures. Do you have any suggestions for what that means for facilitators supporting groups with Indigenous members?
Ashley, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. And I want to make sure I understand the question. For what that means for a facilitator, are we thinking like a non-Indigenous facilitator that is facilitating a group with Indigenous members? Am I understanding that correct? Are you guys understanding it the same?
Yeah, probably it's a non-Indigenous facilitator, or possibly a facilitator from a different Indigenous community, right? It's maybe not always an internal, but I would say focus on a non-Indigenous facilitator.
Yeah, I think one of the best things that you can do is kind of like frame that, non-Indigenous responsibility for moving a conversation forward, or as you say, from a different community. I think that as a facilitator, you're going to bear the responsibility for prefacing this correctly. So maybe if you have an audience that is typically used to, we're going to start here and end here, and this is kind of the cadence of things, and you know that you have Indigenous people who may have a different pacing for things, I think it's important to preface things with like, we're going to allow the space for the right information to come across. And there might be some changes for this, like kind of prepare people for what to expect and what that is and what that should be around values like humility and patience. If you're asking this person to share their knowledge, You need to have the humility and to give them the space to do that in the way that they choose, because there's a reason behind why they're doing that. And I think if you can set that up with the folks that are attending, then you can help them understand, okay, we're actually looking for this information. And so we want to give the space. It helps them give the right space for the information to come across.
Yeah. And I would just add to that, like, interpersonal communication styles in Indian country are also very diverse. Like, there might be some cases in some groups, depending on who your demographic is, where there's a reluctance to talk or to participate. I've seen that happen in the past where, like, there's a kind of like only speak when you're spoken to type of deal, or there's like a you let the leadership talk first, and maybe if you have something that's on your mind that you're going to share, that's when somebody will speak up. But also just be aware of that as a facilitator. Like, sometimes there won't be a lot of group participation. Sometimes people will just be there to take everything in, and maybe in another session on down the road, they might share more, have more to share. But like, a lot of times just the experience is what community members are there for. Like, let me take this in, let me see what's going on, let me feel it out first before I actually like dive into, you know, speaking my piece. And
Excellent.
yeah, and then I just wanted to make sure we didn't skip over Nichols.
Yeah, I'm
Comment.
tracking. I'm
Yeah.
gonna skip around, but I will try my best to get to anybody. So I might not go in order just because we have some themes. So one really interesting theme I wanted to share in the Q&A, Stacy Ziegler was sharing some experience, and then we also had an anonymous question. And this is really about you know, the different perspectives that either tribes or individuals may have in terms of sharing or how it's shared, or preventing the appearance of co-oping, ITEK or TEK, and how to communicate best intentions and, you know, not appear or in action unintentionally appear to be co-oping. And I think Stacy's question is really good, and just I'll encourage you to read it, but I'll review it for those that might not be seeing. Is, I'm pretty new to working with tribal government, Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe in Minnesota, non-native, been told by some that it is not okay to specifically request ITEK, that it isn't for us white people. I'm hearing something different here, and I wonder how to bridge these ideas as I work to be a good steward onto the tribal lands, and be responsive to how the hiring to help care and restore, not wanting to misstep and be respectful. So just kind of those different concepts of sharing and bridging.
Yeah. I mean, I think that this is kind of like where it gets complicated, right? So like, yes, the collective we, the federal government, should seek to incorporate ITEK wherever possible. But like, yeah, if there is a tribe or a group that you're working with that is not open to sharing their knowledge, you do have to listen to them. You do have to accept that, because also and this goes back to kind of what I was speaking about with you know, don't take pictures of sacred spaces, don't share that knowledge once you've been exposed to it. Like, there are going to be a lot of things working in Indian country that you as a non-native person will not know the answer to on purpose. Like, for example, in Pueblo country, like, and I can only speak from my experience, right? There are a lot of things that we do within our governance structure that are secret, right? Like, even for even within our own tribes, like a lot of times men are, you know, the main people in charge of like appointing our government representatives. And like I, as a woman, don't know what that looks like. I don't know what happens in, you know, those processes. And I don't ask, like, because it's just not something that I guess I've been conditioned to accept that, like, I'm not always going to know the answer to everything, and that's okay. But if it does so happen that things change, because, you know, we've been talking about, Ashley also said this, like, this is a dynamic thing. Like, it's not always going to be the same. So maybe right now, Leech Lake Band is like, okay, we don't want you to know anything at all. But then maybe leadership changes, or there's a shift, right? Maybe 2 years from now, they're like, oh, these plants that we use for medicinal purposes are endangered now. We need to focus on conservation. So we're going to tell you what those plants are and where they are, but we don't want anybody to know about it. So you have to respect that. So I would say it's complicated. That's the best answer that I can give. It's complicated, and also like just being respectful, just the fact that you said, I'm always nervous to misstep and not be respectful. Like, you're thinking about it, you're conscious of like, oh, I need to be respectful in these spaces with these, with this knowledge. That's a good start. So just keep that same attitude and remember to be open and humble. Ashley, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I do. I want to just acknowledge that I appreciate this tension and that it's come up as a question. Everyone's head is in the right place, and that's just so exciting to me. I appreciate the tension between what we're saying is engage in this, understand it, get to learn these ways. But we're also saying not everything and not every story and piece of information is just free and up for grabs. And so I think, as Lauren has explained, this is very complex. But the simple piece of it that we can all take hold of is that right and respectful relations. We're asking you to engage in this, but we're not really asking people to come and helicopter in and take what they want and then helicopter out. This is an engagement process. This is a relationship that you have, and you will learn through that process what information is available to you and what is being safeguarded, and generally always for a great reason. Some information is available, but not all information is. Some stories are available, not all stories are available. So the simple piece is to kind of continue on with that humility, ask those questions, and through engaging with the process, you'll be able to sort through the things that are available to you and the things that aren't available to you. And the Indigenous like groups that you work with will have people that can help guide you in that. So it's not a just go and figure it out kind of thing. There are people that are going to help you navigate that. You just have to find them.
This is great. It actually answers a lot of questions. I do want to follow up on one more anonymous question, and I think it's related to this. It's kind of a tag on is, you know, the respectful ways to start a conversation. You know, respectful way to ask tribes to share TEK or how to do it. I think you've already covered this, but I just wanted to make sure you didn't have anything to add to that specific question, and specifically for a federal undertaking, because as we've got a couple questions also on NEPA and processes. And I think an also important piece that I'll add is a commentary from our chat. It was an observation that might be related to this, so I'm going to put it in there, is, you know, let me find Jonathan's comment, or I think Jonathan, hold on, that there is a, yeah, it was John. One of the biggest struggles with incorporating ITK is the government, state or federal agency mindset to quantify what is inherently qualitative. So a lot of different comments. I just wanted to kind of close the loop on that, kind of how do you ask and what it looks like, and see if you had anything to add to those participants.
Well, okay. I would say, what is the most appropriate and respectful way to ask tribes to share TEK? Do they want to share it? That's my first question. Like, first of all, who are you working with? Are you working with the tribe, right? Like, are you working with tribal leadership? Are you working with tribal members? Who is it that you're working with? And do they represent the entire tribe? Like, if it's tribal leaders, they have more of a say overall, right, in what goes on, because they're meant to represent the people. If it's just some group of the tribal membership that is not meant to speak for the entire tribe, I would be a little bit wary of being like, okay, let me ask these people this very sensitive question. Also, like, what is it that you are asking for? A lot of times I think we have a tendency as federal government employees to like put the cart before the horse and be like, okay, let me jump into this and you know, keep it pushing, keep it moving, like we got to make sure we get stuff done, right? But in reality, you need to take a step back and be like, okay, why do I need ITEK in this process? What is it specifically that I'm looking for? Am I looking to incorporate, you know, ceremonial knowledge or locations of ceremonial sites? Like, why do I need to know that? A lot of times there's an inherent need to know, right, from federal agencies. I need to know this thing. I need you to tell me everything so that I can do my job. When in reality, that's not true. You don't need to know that. You know, like I mean, it's terrible to say that, but you don't need to know everything to do your job. So take a step back, figure out what it is that you are needing, right? What it is, what's your goal? And then talk to the tribal folks that you're working with and say, like, all right, I need to know the location of this specific sacred site or whatever it is so that we can protect it or avoid it at all costs. Or I need to know what specific time of the year based off the lunar calendar that you all are not going to be accessible because X, Y, and Z. That doesn't mean you need to know why, that just means you need to know when. So I guess figure out, what is your question? Is it who, what, why, where, when? And then do you actually need to know that? Yeah.
Ashley, anything to add?
No, that was perfect in every regard. Yeah, and I think there's a I just love what Seth is echoing in the chat, is that makes sense. Why does the agency need it? And what about framing things as a question for the tribe too? What benefit does the tribe or tribal government see in sharing this knowledge before requesting such thing? So I think consider what might be the agenda and the interests on the other side. Are you taking those into consideration? Are we assuming that the ask that Indigenous people owe you an answer to that? And so I think going in with the right mindset and the right intentions is going to get you off in the right place there.
So I think this is related. We have a really good specific question on this. And for those of you that have asked questions, don't worry, I am jumping around, but I'm trying to keep a thread here. We had a good example of how would you suggest approaching a situation where the ITEK, the Indigenous Traditional Ecological Knowledge, is in conflict with other scientific empirical evidence that may have been assembled in a regulatory process? For example, imagine where the ITEK indicates the existence of a site of significance, either an archaeological site or a resource at a particular location, but the archaeological survey does not indicate that site or resource is present. How do you navigate that disagreement between the Western archaeological science and ITEK? And I have examples, but I want to hear from our speakers first.
You look like you want to go. Go.
Go.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So I think there's a book called Misplaced Massacre by Ari Kelman, and the book is about the site of the Sand Creek Massacre and exactly this issue. What if an archaeological dig says this, but Indigenous stories and Indigenous knowledge says that? And I don't want to ruin the story, but I kind of have to make this point. Essentially, what they come to find is that both are true, that the Indigenous knowledge was correct, and the archaeological dig was correct. At the same time, there was a certain phenomena that ended up moving the site. So both people ended up being true. Keep an open mind, and sometimes a downside of Western scientists is this like idea of like like if it's science, it's the divine, and just be open to being wrong, and that there are other explanations for things that you don't understand. And this book perfectly exemplifies that issue, and that is Misplaced Massacre, about the Sand Creek Massacre by Ari Kelman.
I feel like that answered the question, and I think it's consistent with the ITEK guidance. So Lauren, did you want to add anything of like both can be true and allow a space for a dialogue between of both those perspectives? Lauren?
Yeah, I think that how do I say this? From my perspective and in my experience, like I have been taught largely based off of just oral teachings and traditional knowledge. So I trust that first. Does that sound crazy? Like that's just how I've been taught. Like I've always taken what my elders have taught me, what my elders have passed down to me as, you know, that's what's true, that's what's real, that's what's to be trusted. And maybe that's just my parents, like, you know, brainwashing me into this into the state of like, yes, we're you know, a traditional family, that's how we do things, we never question. So just as an example, like my grandma's sister taught me about some of the Bannock War sites where the Bannocks, because I'm Shoshone Bannock as well as Taos Pueblo and Tusuki Pueblo, they were fighting the U.S. cavalry soldiers, and there were several sites that like we know that like the Bannock people know exist, where our warriors are buried and they have been relocated. But you know, this also speaks to the same thing that Ashley was talking about, like even if there aren't remains there, right, even if there isn't like a physical even if there aren't physical remains, that doesn't mean that harm wasn't done or the spirit of someone isn't attached to that place. It can still be ceremonially or spiritually significant, even if there is nothing there. Like we as Native people, we as Indigenous people, we exist in this space where we are connected to things that have happened to our ancestors, that have happened to generations before us. Like if I were to go to one of those Bannock War sites, would I put down tobacco and would I pray? Yes. Would I do ceremony there? Absolutely. Like, because that's our way.
Thank you, Lauren. I think it also signifies that, you know, areas might be sacred without like the empirical data that folks want, just by nature of the fact that it's connection to the people. So that's another consideration. I am answering actually a couple questions via chat if you all want to deal with it. Actually, I'll just say it. There was a quick question. I'll just take this one really quickly of, you know, how I'm beginning to work with someone who directs a natural resource program for a tribe. Is it safe to assume that that person is a member of the tribe? And I would say, don't assume. Most people will identify their tribal affiliation. There's a lot of non-Indigenous people that work for tribes. Likewise, there's folks that are members of tribes that may not work for their member tribe. They might work for a different tribe. And so they may not be the holder of knowledge for the tribe that they work for, the Natural Resource Department. It's allow folks to identify that, don't make assumptions of that identity or affiliation. So I just wanted to cover that one really quickly. And I'm going over to the top. Seth, only because you know Lauren and you can get a hold of Ashley, I'm going to hold off on your hand raise, but if others want to raise their hand, they can. Seth works for the National Center. We had a question of incorporating ITEK into a NEPA analysis process. I think this relates to how we talked before about different processes. And I would stress that, NEPA has a timeline. It starts really quickly. So you may need to talk about ITEK before the NEPA process starts, just because we've already established time. But I just wanted to see if either of you have experience with NEPA specifically that you wanted to share with that participant of, incorporating ITEK in a NEPA analysis process, or anything to add beyond what we've already covered.
Can they come off mute and kind of give a little bit more context?
Serena, I'm gonna allow you to unmute. So if you want to cover that a little bit more detail.
Thanks.
Or Serena might have jumped off.
Oh, okay.
So Serena, we will follow up on that one later, but I think basically NEPA has a timeline. You have time structure, and everything we talked about is, timing might not work. So I think it's also about understanding that relationship, that you may need to have dialogue on ITEK and be really thoughtful. But I just didn't know if you wanted to answer anything more. All right, we have a couple people that have to drop off early, so.
Okay.
All right. Oh, you might like this one, Lauren. We have a question about any thoughts on ITEK and artificial intelligence.
Yeah, it's scary. It's terrifying. It's, as a Pueblo person, it keeps me up at night. I'm horrified. Part of it is like, and we talk about this, I've talked about this with some of my interns who are from Pueblo villages as well, because we, as Pueblo people, like as I was speaking about before, like we have shared our ceremonial knowledge with people in the past, or like invited non-native folks into our spaces and had them like write whole volumes of textbooks on, exposing all of our our most sacred and most holy practices. There's still books out there in the world floating around that basically detail all of Zuni Pueblo's, ceremonies. And for AI to be incorporated into the mix, like if you were to just give any sort of AI like a basic knowledge of like Taos Pueblo practices, and then have it extrapolate like what are their deer dance ceremonies look like, and to have it just like pop out an answer that could be close to what is true or what is real, like that's horrifying. I think that tribes like that are concerned about protecting ceremonial knowledge need to really lay out, I guess, I don't actually know. Like, I don't know if it would need to be like federal legislation protecting ceremonial knowledge, or if it would need to be like, I'm not really sure. But I think that there needs to be more restrictions on AI, like what AI can access, or like what people can use AI for. And I think that in reality, yeah, it's just scary. It's horrifying.
Ashley, I don't know if you wanted to add, but it's almost a good transition to a lot of questions we're having on data sovereignty and data confidentiality and AI. But before we move on to that, I wanted to see if you wanted to add anything. Okay. So we've had a lot of questions about informal agreements, either in terms of sharing, protecting data sovereignty. And I do want to point out there are a couple of webinars that we have done at the National Center. Ben is going to plug those links in on data sovereignty and data governance and MOUs. And spoiler alert for those, not nearly as significant as Ashley's spoiler alert. It really having agreements in place in advance is going to be key to protecting that data sovereignty and being really specific. There's some great comments in response to what Lauren was sharing of specificity is really important. Do you need that information, and what information do you need and why? And having a collaborative discussion on that in terms of sharing ITEK and its relevance is going to be important. But the fact of the matter is, and we also had some questions on FOIA. So I'm jumping in here, but I do want you all to add, because I know, Lauren, you'll probably want me to say, the Federal Freedom of Information Act has exemptions, it has qualifications, but almost every Indigenous person I've ever worked with, the second that data is in the federal government's hands, there's a potential for it to be released, despite best intentions, either FOIA. So that's why being really clear of what data will be shared and why, and making sure that the tribe is comfortable with how it's shared is really key. And even if there are FOIA exemptions, there's court cases, those might change. The data sovereignty agreements are really important, and maintaining tribes' control over that data is important and how it's shared. So I know there's a couple questions on FOIA. We actually have a project at the National Center, and pretty much we're saying tribes are the ones that hold that data. They tell the story that they want the public to know, and then it's a matter of what they might want to share to counter any specific data or requirements, either a NEPA analysis or something else. But FOIA can get scary, and there's very specific requirements for federal agencies. So the best frame of action is full disclosure, clear agreements with the tribes, and leaving as much of that data and information in the hands of the tribe, and let them make the decision of how it's going to be shared and when. So I'm sorry to take that over from our speakers, but I wanted to kind of bring all those data sovereignty questions together. Ashley or Lauren, anything to add?
I mean, not really.
Okay, Ashley? All right, cool. Sorry, didn't mean to jump in. We have another question about formal agreements. I think it's related to this. Formal agreements and compensation for Indigenous knowledge holders when your agency is seeking understanding. That's going to be very specific from an agency to agency, if we're being honest, and from a tribe to tribe. So that's kind of MOUs with the tribe in terms of compensation. And then also be very clear within your own legislative authority of how you're allowed to compensate, because monetary stipends or honorariums or payment for time, those are kind of the standard federal, we're going to compensate you for the time, but that might not be the traditional way of compensating for some of that time. And different agencies have different authorities in the way that they can show respect and acknowledge the gift of the knowledge that's been shared. So I would just add that it takes a little bit of time to do your research, and probably working with your general counsel on some of those compensation and agreements pieces. Ashley or Lauren, anything to add?
There's just a lot of questions. I'm just like scrolling through all the questions.
All right. Oh, I've got you mostly covered. You've been getting through a couple good ones.
Well, I saw this question. As a Native American and federal employee, I've had concerns about lifting pieces of information from the broader context. Some information should only be shared after prayer or ceremony. How can we message around that? And like, I relate to that because I'm a federal employee and Native. So for me, like, I always think in the context of like, again, getting back to the like, why does it need to be shared? What is it that will be gained from sharing that information? Ultimately, it's your prerogative what you want to share and what you don't, but always remember, like, it's not just you. You're not just out here by yourself. Like, you're a part of your home community. You're a part of, you represent more than just yourself or your tribe. Like, unfortunately, that's how it is for us as federal government employees who are Native. Like, we're a lot of times the only Native voice in the room, and it sucks to be like under that much pressure. But I always think about it in terms of like, what do I need to, I guess, like, what's the minimum that I can share that will help further the conversation without like saying too much or disclosing too much. So
Ashley, anything to add?
Sure. I think I deal with this question a little bit differently than Lauren does. So I don't work for a federal organization, but I am an academic, and I often come across the kind of conundrum of like, if my job is to record history and argue it and talk about it, what is it? There's not a free for all there. I don't get to just pull any piece of information and turn it into a book or anything like that. The way that I navigate that for myself is maintaining close ties to my community. So my work is on the Pacific Northwest. And so if I am engaging in conversations and arguments about Indigenous history, boy, you can be sure I am connected with elders and people in my community who can help navigate and mentor me in an appropriate way. And that comes at many levels. So I write a lot about fishing. So I maintain connections with the fishing community in Quinault, with the political leadership in Quinault, with the cultural leadership, with the cultural resources manager. Other elders are my mentors. So I think not to say that everyone has the opportunity to just go back to their tribe and just like, pull from all of this mentorship, but there is something to be said with engaging with the community and being a part of this system where you can navigate those questions. I've messaged people in the community and said, hey, I'm thinking about this. Is this something that I want to share? Is this something that's helpful to share, or harmful to share? And have had conversations about those things. So that's how I choose to navigate that.
Thank you, Ashley. And I think that relates to a question we got in the chat that I just wanted to bring up. And this was for Caitlin. Ryan mentioned in chat, I sometimes wonder about representation of a community and whether one particular person from a tribe or reservation should be taken as the official representation. There's additional context in there I'll let you read, but I guess the question probably for ECCR practitioners, for federal agencies, like, how do you know who to speak to for this Indigenous knowledge on behalf of the tribe or as community members? So any additional context, I think what you shared, Ashley, is kind of appropriate to that question, and the answer, the person you're talking to is probably going to reach out to the community, but you should make sure that process is being followed. And then also, federal governments work sovereign to sovereign, so probably want to make sure that the tribe is saying, yes, this is our ITEK representative, but that might not be all of it. But anything to add based on Caitlin's comment or question?
Well, I think most tribes do have many tribes have a cultural resources manager. So maybe even just getting in touch with them or whoever you're in touch with, I think it's okay to ask the question, hey, is there anybody else I should be talking to on this? And they will generally tell you. But I just have to appreciate this question because I'm currently doing a lot of reading on colonial America. And this question goes all the way back to like the Puritans in New England. It goes back to the French in what is now the Midwest. Like, this is kind of everyone's issue as they're engaging with Indigenous people for just such a long time. French, the Puritans just go to the wrong people generally. And when they started asking the questions like, who else do we need to talk to? What other Indigenous leaders are there that we need to talk to? Then it kind of opened their eyes to, there isn't just like this like monolith of like authority in Indigenous culture. There are a lot of people that make up leadership within Indigenous groups. And it looks different from tribe to tribe. And so once you start asking questions like that, just as our friends, the Puritans, did in the 17th century, you'll start finding some of those answers. Sorry, a historian's ramblings. Thank you for allowing me that.
I think it was great and extremely on point. So I do want to be cognizant of time. We have a lot of questions. I don't know if we'll get through everybody's questions, but if we didn't get through your question, we'll try to put an answer in the follow-up. We have one request maybe for an example, and Ashley, this might be something you've experienced generally, is Gail, towards the end of the Q&A, you'll notice they have a situation where tribal nations have asked that Indigenous knowledge be incorporated into their Endangered Species Act framework that the program is shaped by. Is there a story you have that illustrates success and how Indigenous knowledge has been brought into an endangered species framework where the mutual benefits of that kind of conversation, consistent with what you were sharing, but like a real life story? And I'm thinking, Ashley, you might have some experience with that just in the context of salmon or steelhead.
Sure. I'm going to treat this one a little bit like a hot potato, and anyone from the Northwest is going to understand why the Marine Mammal Protection Act and penniped management in the Pacific Northwest with salmon is a great case study to look at for how to navigate that particular issue. I would say look into that, and I'm going to go ahead and toss that hot potato because it's too contentious for me to spend too much time holding. But I will also say kind of an example from my own experience is this isn't necessarily related to endangered species, but certainly in terms of like a management situation. The tribe was working with I think U.S. Forest Service and some folks from the state in Washington, talking about buffer zones for logging up to rivers. And there's, some science that they were leading on to say buffer zones should be this in order to ensure the protection of rivers, because, salmon rivers need shade. They need, good structural river banks. And so as they were navigating this, the guides on the river, myself and my peers, were noticing that in certain areas, the Quinault River is a very volatile river. There are sections in the Pacific Northwest that get, close to 200 inches of rain a year. Compare that with what the rainy city, Seattle, gets, which is about 30 inches a year of rain. And we have some comparison. This is an extreme amount of water. But the guides on the river were the ones that were kind of seeing that even though we have this kind of buffer zone that we have been using in certain areas, this isn't working. And we know this because we float the river every day and we are watching riverbanks erode at certain points. And so using some of that knowledge and taking that to some of our meetings, and the Forest Service being really open to having those conversations with us, we were able to kind of change how some of that looked for our area in the Pacific Northwest. There are a lot of big trees, a lot of big river. And so I think that's an example of that working together really well. But Marine Mammal Protection Act would be a very interesting one to look at in the Pacific Northwest.
Excellent. And good visual on the hot potato. Ashley, can you maybe write the name of that case study in the chat box that you mentioned for folks? And then I know there's a couple more questions, and I'm going to acknowledge that folks are really interested in digging deeper on some of these ITEK application and integration. So we'll take that under consideration for future webinars. There's also a desire to dig deeper into this concept of economics and environmental protection. And so we'll look at digging deeper into that dialogue as well. I did want to leave, we have a couple folks, we have some great comments in the Q&A in terms of ethnographic data and the importance of that, and kind of the role of judges in protecting ITEK. There's a whole host of Washington cases where there is precedent of using Indigenous knowledge as data and evidence in federal courts. So please take a look at those. And if you have questions, we'll plop those in as a follow-up. But I did want to end with, a lot of folks were talking about, you mentioned talk to people you know from the community, learning about the history and protocols and procedures. And we have a couple questions of, where do you start if you don't have contacts, or you don't know who to talk to, or you don't know or work with anybody who's worked with tribes in that region or that tribe or that space? So where do you start when you're starting at ground zero?
Go to a powwow. I'm just kidding. We're gonna send out a watch reservation dogs. We're gonna send out a resource list, actually, that has a list of intertribal organizations and their values, a great list that the Native American Rights Fund put together of tribal constitutions and law code, as well as what else is on there? Oh, the Gwen Bridge presentation that we talked about earlier. But also, yeah, I mean, just sort of educate yourself as best you can, but also there have to be people who work in your agency or who you are connected with who work with Indigenous people and with intertribal organizations. It's easier than you think to engage with tribal folks, and you can always reach out to me in the NAN service area. We're committed to, this is what we do, so hit us up.
All
And
right.
go to a powwow. I mean,
Because why not?
yeah, it's fun.
Or gathering. Sometimes they're called gatherings.
Mhm.
All right. So we do have other questions. There's a lot of great comments in the chat. So we will save the chat. We'll exclude the personal information out of that chat, but we'll share that so you can have links to the notes and everything. I apologize. We went a little bit over, but we started off saying that time is different. So hopefully all of you appreciate that. We know there's more to talk about, and we will definitely do our best to meet those needs of the community of practice. Thank you all for joining us. If you're not a member of the community of practice, email nan@udall.gov. It's in the chat. And just a huge thank you to my colleague, Lauren Cordova, for pulling this together and being a speaker from your personal experiences as well as experiences at the National Center. And a huge thank you to our alum for the Udall Scholars Program, Ashley, Nichole Lewis.
Great job.
So really appreciate everyone for participating. We'll be sharing information via email. If you registered, you'll get the links. Some of that was in the chat. We'll be going through some of the questions and we'll get back to you, but just want to close out for today, let you all get on with your day, and look forward to further discussions. Thank you so much.